From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for joining us today at the Library of Congress. My name is Jacob Nadal. I'm the Director for Preservation here at the library. Every spring, libraries across the U.S. celebrate Preservation Week, an event that was started in 2010 as a joint effort between the library, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and working in partnership with professional societies like the American Library Association, the American Institute for Conservation, and the Society of American Archivists. Preservation Week is always a welcome opportunity to share both our technical knowledge and our sense of purpose. Every day, across all of the library's facilities, preservation staff reshelve materials that were consulted the day before. They ensure that everything is in its place and ready for the next researcher. They perform the treatments that keep our collections usable. And when materials are too fragile for use or their formats become obsolete, they create new versions to ensure that information stays available. Preservation staff also do the scientific research required to ensure that we understand the risks that face our collections and that we have strategies to bring them into the future. We do that work to make sure that everything collected here in the library has a pathway into the future. From time to time, however, Congress gives the library special direction to attend to the preservation issues of concern to the American people. Because of that, I'm especially glad that we can showcase the Veterans History Project today. We have 167 million items in the collection at the last count, and we add thousands more each day. So when I say that my staff of 180 is 1 in a million, I mean it both from the heart and from the calculator. Working on the Veterans History Project is a good reminder that preservation and library collection building are not just numbers games. It's not just one of us and a million more things to take care of. Those treatment hours, the inventory records, all of the work of building a collection adds up to something that matters to people, both to individuals and to communities. During events like Preservation Week, and as I speak with colleagues across the country, I'm always inspired to see how libraries, archives, historical societies, and other collecting institutions engage with people in their communities to bring the past into the present. I think the Veterans History Project is a great example of this. So now I will hand the stage over to Karen Lloyd, Director of the VHP. Thank you, Karen.
Good afternoon. He's taller than me. Thank you for choosing to be here today. I'm Karen Lloyd. I'm a retired Army Aviation Colonel and the Director of the Veterans History Project. First, I'd like to give a shout out to Jake and his whole team for asking the Veterans History Project to be part of this amazing event. One of our major challenges is convincing veterans and their loved ones to part with some of those unique and original items that illuminate their narrative. I know from firsthand experience how hard it is to part with these treasures, but I have come to understand the importance of ensuring these artifacts are available for future generations and how the library's Preservation Directorate, under Jake's leadership, makes that possible. As a veteran, as the widow of a veteran, the child and sibling of veterans, the Veterans History Project, to me, is more than a job. It's rewarding and it's purposeful. I ask you, how many of you can say, I'm living the dream, when you talk to other folks? Today, if we're successful, we will pass on that same enthusiasm about the Veterans History Project to you. My hope is that you leave today with a sense of urgency to gather the narratives of veterans. VHP is your opportunity to make a meaningful difference for the veteran in your life or your community. The Veterans History Project is one of the library's most popular programs. It is one of the largest oral history projects in the country. Its congressional mandate is to collect, preserve, and make accessible the personal accounts of American veterans so that future generations may hear directly from those veterans and better understand their selfless service. Oral history is a principal conduit for folklore. It is through oral history that we learn about the life experiences and perspectives of individuals who might not otherwise appear in historical record. It also provides a rich opportunity for human interaction. I am grateful that Congress understood the oral history aspect of folklore when it developed the Veterans History Project. Over the past 17 years, we have collected over 105,000 different firsthand narratives, ranging from oral histories to diaries to letters to photographs, even 2D artwork. Our collection spans from World War I through the current conflicts. We include every branch, ethnicity, gender, and conflict. Our diverse and rich collection is a start, but with over 17 million veterans in America today, there's a lot of work left to be done, and we need your help. It would have been impossible for our staff to archive this much history without the direct involvement of volunteers from across the country who interview veterans in their lives. By using the Veterans History Project as a tool, you help the nation preserve our veterans' stories so that we, together, can create a living, lasting memorial to military service. Decades, even hundreds of years from now, people won't have to wonder what happened during the wars and conflicts represented by the veterans who were interviewed. They will be able to hear it directly from those who were there, from the pointy end of the spear to those rear echelons. Our veterans will tell you we need the whole story to fully understand the complete experience. The Veterans History Project was created with the purpose to collect, preserve, and make accessible the memories of our nation's veterans so that we can hear directly from them and capture what they saw, felt, and heard, the human experience of military service. Collect. Reach out to the veterans in your lives and communities and listen, really listen, to their stories and donate them to the Library of Congress. Why, you ask? To ensure we don't lose those voices and those stories. Today you'll hear from Rachel Telford, the VHP archivist, and the Preservation Directorate team that supports VHP about the techniques and procedures available to them to preserve these original artifacts so they remain accessible for future generations. Rachel?
So before the conservators get into the details of how they preserve the individual items in our collections, I just want to give some background on a few collections that they'll be talking about, just to provide some context and give you a sense of exactly what it is we're preserving and the stories that are captured in these items. I'm just going to highlight three. The first is the collection of Albert John Carpenter. This is the only photo we have of him. He is in the back row, second from the right. And he served in the Army with the 142nd Infantry Regiment during World War I. He was in France in the trenches during the final days of the war, so he experienced bombings and gas attacks and all the worst that World War I had to offer. He, fortunately for us, kept a diary, so we know a little bit about his experience. His entries were fairly brief, to the point, but they contain quite vivid descriptions of his experiences. On October 11th, 1918, he wrote, 142nd casualties still enlarging. Am very weak. Only 2 good meals since on front. 12 a.m., a gas shell came over. Did not get my gas mask on quick enough. Sent to field hospital, taken about 20 pills, and sent back to the lines. So he conveys quite a lot just in a few short lines. These are a couple pages from his diary. The diary itself came to us unbound. It's just loose pages, and as you can see, there's a little bit of water damage there that happened at some point before we received it. And in a few minutes, our conservators will talk about some of the work that they have done to help ensure that the content of the diary remains accessible. But the preservation of this item starts a little bit earlier than that. The veterans' family donated the diary to us in 2002, and they knew that they were going to make it accessible to researchers. They knew that it would be securely housed, but several years after the donation, the veteran's daughter-in-law, Shirley Carpenter, got in touch with us to let us know how important that decision to donate this diary really was. She used to keep the diary in a box in her hall closet, along with the family Bible and all the important documents of that family history. And she lives down on the Gulf Coast, and in 2005, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita swept through her town, left 5 feet of standing water in her house, and destroyed everything that was in that box. So all those pieces of her family history were destroyed, except for this diary, because she had made that decision to send it to us, and it was safely housed 1,000 miles away. So Albert Carpenter's story is available here today because she took that first step in preserving the diary and donating it to the Veterans History Project. The second collection is Samuel Coolatta. He's a World War II veteran. He was from Baltimore, and when he was 17, immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he tried to enlist in the Marine Corps. He had flat feet, so they wouldn't take him, but shortly after that, he was able to enlist in the Navy, and he served with the Naval Assault Beach Party. He has quite a large collection. It includes an oral history interview. It also includes diaries, memoirs, correspondence, maps, news clippings, all kinds of materials that document his service. He was a medic. He participated in 9 island invasions in the Pacific. So he saw close combat, he saw terrible casualties, and there are a number of incredible stories that are captured in his collection. One of my favorites is the story of this little boy. His name was Kunoa Joseph. He lived in Enewetak in the Marshall Islands, and his family, his community, was caught literally in the middle of the war. And he was injured by shrapnel and brought aboard the USS Cambria for treatment, and Sam Coolatta was given the job of taking care of him and making sure that he got back to his family in good health. And he mentions this sort of briefly in his oral history, but through the original material in his collection, we can really get a sense of the impact that this experience had on him. There are a number of photos. As you can see here, the ship's tailor made a little uniform for him. You can also see in this photo that he's got bandages on both of his hands. And based on some of these images we have, he's there in the center. It seems like the guys on the ship really liked him. Samuel Coolatta certainly did. He wrote in his diary that he became quite fond of him, they were both very upset when it was time for him to go back to his family. He describes quickly leaving him with the sailors who were taking him back because he didn't want to see the boy crying as he was leaving. And this is an experience that definitely stuck with him because 60 years later, he tried to track this boy down, and he wrote to the Embassy of the Marshall Islands, and despite only having a summary of events and a phonetic spelling of the boy's name, he was actually able to find him. It turned out this little boy grew up to be a member of the Island Council, and apparently has been telling this story of the time he got to hang out on a U.S. Navy ship with all his sailor friends for his entire life. So that letter got into the hands of a local politician who immediately knew who it was about. So after 60 years, they were reunited here in DC. So our oral history collections are an incredible resource, but in this case, if we just had that veteran's oral history, we'd know a little bit about this. He talked about it for maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes, but there's not a lot of detail. But because he donated all this additional material, we know a lot more about that experience and how he felt about it, both at the time as well as in later years. And so it is a much richer story for having that additional detail. Final collection is that of George Washington Piercy. He served in the Army and Army Air Forces during World War II. He shipped out to the Philippines in early 1941, so he was there before the outbreak of war in the Pacific. And during this period, he was an incredibly prolific letter writer. He would write 5, 10, sometimes 15-page letters to his parents, describing his daily life, his impressions of the Philippines, his plans for the future, and he would regularly remind them to keep all of his letters, keep everything he was sending back. He would tell them exactly where they were supposed to be keeping all this material. Like every other letter, don't forget to keep my letters. So it was clear that he thought his experience was important and interesting. He wanted to document it, and he mentioned possibly wanting to write a book about his experience, so it was clear that he wanted to share his experience later on. After the war began, he was no longer able to write these lengthy letters, and in 1942, he was taken prisoner by Japanese forces and held in several prison camps in the Philippines. After he was captured, he was only able to send a few brief postcards home, but he did keep a diary. And diaries, we know, often weren't allowed in Japanese prison camps, so this probably was kept in secret, potentially at great risk. We do know that he was clearly using whatever paper he could find. Here we see some used labels from cans of food, and behind that there's part of a map. But this wasn't entirely used as a traditional diary. We can see evidence that he's trying to keep his mind active. while he's imprisoned. Here he's making a list of things he wants to do when he gets home. In another section, he's compiling a list of personal property that he lost when the war began because he plans to petition the government for reimbursement for all of those items. And this is another one of his diaries. Here he's repurposing medical records that he found at DeVal Penal Colony where he was being held. And you'll hear shortly about the physical preservation of diaries, but the first step in preserving these diaries happened long before they got here. In 1944, Piercy was to be transported to Japan on a prison ship, and so he gave all of his papers to a fellow prisoner who was staying behind named Robert Auger for safekeeping and asked him to return the material to him if he was able to keep it with him when he got home. George Piercy didn't make it to Japan. His unmarked prisoner transport was sunk by a U.S. submarine in late 1944. But Robert Auger remained in the Philippines, was eventually liberated by U.S. forces, and shortly after returning to the U.S., he made good on his promise, and he mailed the diaries to Piercy's parents. And it would be several more months before his parents found out what had happened to him. So naturally, after that terrible news, they saved everything, and this all got passed down through his family to his nephews, who eventually made the decision to donate this material to us here at the Veterans History Project. And at that time, it was the only Pacific Theater POW diary that we had in our collections, so the importance of preserving these particular items really can't be overstated. We actually now have 2 Pacific Theater POW diaries. The second one belonged to his buddy, Robert Auger. So our conservators are going to tell you more about exactly how they preserve these items for us, and we'll have some of them on display afterwards. We also have a number of items on display in the exhibit, Echoes of the Great War, here in the Jefferson Building. And on May 26th, we'll be presenting a one-man show called An American Soldier's Journey Home, which is based on the World War I diary of Irving Greenwald, which you can see here. But for now, I will turn things over to our conservators, who will tell you more about the incredible work they do with our material.
Hello. Like Rachel said, my name is Jennifer, and I'm from the Conservation Division. We have a couple of us here today to talk to you. The Conservation Division is responsible for the physical preservation of the library's special collections. And this includes everything from examining collection items to assess their condition, creating written and photographic documentation, treating items that require intervention or stabilization, monitoring the environment throughout the library stacks to make sure that we're keeping everything in the best possible conditions. We prepare collection materials for loan, exhibition, and digitization, and we prepare for and respond to potential disasters. In addition, we support and promote the field of conservation by giving lectures, conducting and publishing original research, training conservation interns and fellows, and serving in leadership roles in the professional community. The Conservation Division staff includes book conservators, and our lab is pictured in the image on the left, and paper and photograph conservators, and their lab is in the picture on the right. We also have a number of preservation specialists and conservation technicians. I think as conservators that we are not only fortunate to work here at the Library of Congress, but that we have some of the best jobs in the library. We get to interact with a wide variety of items from the collection. Our work requires us to learn more about the collections from the curators and archivists. And basically, we get to experience a really unique, physical, tangible connection with our shared material, culture, and history on a daily basis. And although today we're mostly going to talk to you about conservation treatments, I also would like to mention that quite a bit of work takes place up front when an item first comes into the lab. Objects are first examined to evaluate their physical structure, composition, and condition. And in the picture on my left, you can see Gwen Ann, my colleague, examining a book containing Japanese colorant samples under a microscope, and she's looking to assess lead-red deterioration. In the photo on the right, you can see someone doing preparing to take photographic images to document the condition of an item before it is treated. We also write extensive documentation detailing as much information as possible about the item, and this includes information such as its creator, how it was manufactured or created, its present physical condition, and all of this information helps us to make informed decisions about the best way to treat or care for an item. And finally, we meet with curators and archivists to discuss treatment options and get approval prior to undertaking any physical treatment of an item. Conservators receive highly specialized training, either through graduate programs or intensive apprenticeships. We learn about the structure of physical materials and take extensive coursework in chemistry. But conservation is a mix of art and science, so we also have to become skilled in craftsmanship. We learn about the historical construction of physical items, because in order to fix something, you also have to have an inherent understanding of how that thing is made. In graduate training programs for book conservation, we're taught to recreate historical binding models so we can better understand their structures, see weak points where the physical materials are likely to fail, and learn how to best fix these issues. Conservators are both scientists and craftsmen, and like all craftsmen, we love our tools. And these are just some of the tools that conservators frequently use. You probably recognize a lot of them: scissors, brushes, X-Acto knives. But some that you might not be as familiar with are, in the top left, there's a jar of wheat starch paste, which is an adhesive that we often use in conservation. The top right is a paring knife, which book conservators use when working with leather. At the bottom, there's 2 sheets of long fiber Japanese tissue, which is often used as a repair material because it's very strong, transparent, and flexible. And then the kind of more tan-colored paper is a rag pulp paper that we actually make in-house here in the library. And this can also be used as a repair paper. I'm one of 10 special collections conservators in the book lab at the Library of Congress. We're responsible for treating bound items from the library's vast repository of collections. Unlike a museum, we don't only collect priceless art, like medieval manuscripts and important works of art on paper. Although we do have an incredible collection of those things, we also have very important collections that encompass the entire range of human experience. Many of the items in Veterans History Project collections do not at casual glance have the characteristics of something you might consider to be part of a special collection. There are no jeweled bindings or gilded illuminations, or if there are, I haven't seen them. And a lot of the items have been created by people whose names you might not be familiar with, but they connect us to our past on an individual level, and they allow us to experience the world through a time and a perspective other than our own. And these are some examples of books from the Veterans History Project collections that have recently been treated in book conservation. On the top left is a scrapbook that belongs to Robert Frank Auger, and he's the veteran that Rachel mentioned as saving Coolatta's diaries and letters. He was an Army captain wounded in action, and he was a Japanese prisoner of war for 33 months during World War II. And after the war, he did a lot of work promoting the sale of war bonds. And this scrapbook, which I believe was probably made by his wife, contains a lot of newspaper clippings about his work selling war bonds. The top right is a very brittle diary written by Joseph Schweitzer, who served on an ammunition train during World War I. His diary was written on very fragile and acidic paper, and it was disbound and rehoused in a newly constructed post binding to allow for safe handling. And at the bottom right is a publisher's blank book that was used as a diary by William Hearn, Jr., another soldier during the Great War. There's a huge variety of bound materials in the Veterans History Project collection. These items form an important part of our cultural heritage, and when they become part of our collections, we treat them with the same deliberate care, precision, and consideration as we would any other books or manuscripts in our special collections. So now I'm going to talk in a little more detail about the conservation of diaries written by 2 different veterans. The first, Samuel Anthony Coolatta, served as a medical corpsman in the U.S. Navy during World War II, as you heard. He was only 18 when he enlisted, and during his time at the Pacific Theater, he wrote a series of diaries and 5 small notebooks. They came into the conservation lab in pretty poor condition, with loose pages, broken sewing thread, and torn and crumpled edges. And I chose this image on the left from one of his diaries because I think this is a huge part of what makes the Veterans History collection so compelling. At the beginning of the entry, Coolatta notes, "And so ends my uneventful birthday. I nicked my nose shaving," which is sort of an everyday mundane observation. However, at the end of the same page, he also writes, "I've reached a hardened state of mind where it concerns war. but if I ever got to thinking too much of what I've seen and participated in, I believe I'd go nuts. This is a really sad and profound reflection from someone who is still too young to vote, and a reminder that Coolatta, along with many of the veterans whose diaries are now part of the VHP collections, was just an ordinary young man living through very extraordinary circumstances. War is brutal and impersonal, but his diaries, along with those of other veterans, help to personify these historical events and provide us a valuable link to our past. This is another of Coolatta's diaries. You can see in the photo on the left that it's been mended with tape. Normally, if something were covered in tape, we'd probably decide to remove it. My colleague Gwinan will talk more about that in one of her treatments, but essentially, the adhesives in tape can damage the paper substrate, making it discolored and brittle. However, Coolatta used medical tape, which was likely the only tape available to him, on the binding of this diary. This is another part of what makes the VHP collections particularly unique. Signs of use and repair are often part of the intrinsic history of the item, and are carefully considered when undertaking a conservation treatment. That grime on the covers might be from a battlefield or a foxhole rather than just general use over time. And tape is what Coolatta had on hand as a medical officer to fix his diary when it was falling apart. Here you can see it mended. This is the diary after treatment. The broken sewing was causing the pages to fall out of the binding, and as a result, some of the loose pages had become torn and damaged. A repair tissue was used to mend the tears and strengthen fragile paper around the edges. Creases in the pages that were covering text were carefully humidified and gently unfolded. Loose pages were mended to recreate their original bifolios, and the diary was resewn as it was originally. And you can see that this diary isn't even a properly bound book. It's just a compilation of loose pages, and it's probably all that Coolatta had at his disposal. You can see that the ink is bled, probably from changes in humidity. Perhaps he got caught in a rainstorm while the diary was tucked into his pocket. In this case, the edges of the pages were crumpled, with numerous tears and creases that obscured text. The tears were mended, the creases were flattened, and it's now possible to easily read the diary. In addition to performing conservation treatments, we often create custom housings for collection items. After they were treated, each of Coolatta's diaries was individually rehoused in a custom four-flap enclosure to ensure that the unbound manuscript pages stay together and that the diaries are protected during storage. The second diary that I'll talk about was written by Ewing Harry Miller. Miller served in France as a first lieutenant during World War I. He wrote his diary in a blank account book with beautifully marbled edges and a leather spine. At some point, the spine leather fell off and the sewing thread broke, which left the diary vulnerable to damage during even the most careful use. You can see here that the front cover has fallen completely off of the binding. And here's another slide showing damage. As you can see in the top photo, the pages are starting to fall out of the diary, and the sewing is partially gone along the spine, along with most of the spine leather. So the diary was disbound and resewn, which means that all of the pages are now mechanically attached to each other to form a single solid text block. This image shows the sewing frame in our book lab. You can see that the thread goes into and out of the sections and wraps around the cord sewing supports before the next section is sewn on. In a lot of modern books, the pages are just glued together at the spine, but in most older books, the pages are actually sewn together like this in a variety of ways. I don't often get to resew an entire text block like this, but when I get to, it's one of my favorite parts of treatment, partially because it's just fun to sew a book, but also because it provides a sense of connection to the craftsmen of the past, since bookbinders have used these same methods for centuries. Here you can see that the text block is now completely sewn. The spine has been lined with cloth, and the front and back cover boards have been reattached. This was done by inserting the cloth that lines the spine beneath the lifted leather on the spine edges. The book is now essentially back together and functions like a bound volume. However, it's still missing a leather spine. When we buy new skins of leather for repair, they're usually too thick and stiff to use as is, which means we have to thin them down to a more usable thickness. This green machine pictured in the image is called a Charfix, and it has a very sharp blade that runs parallel to a small horizontal metal cylinder. As the leather is pulled through between the blade and the rotating cylinder, a thin strip of suede is removed from the skin, which decreases its overall thickness. This can also be done by hand, using a knife like you saw in the image of the tools, or a spoke shave. Paring usually takes quite a while to get an even, thin leather that is suitable for repair. These are some of the finishing tools that we have in the lab. They're brass tools with wooden handles that can be heated over a stove and used to impress gold lines and designs in leather. Although these tools are probably only about 20 years old, tools just like this have been used for hundreds of years. There has not been a lot of change to the technology. The jar in the back of the picture holds scraps of gold foil. Unfortunately, there were just enough of the original spine lines left on Miller's diary to tell where the lines had been originally tooled. And here you can see the completed treatment. The diary has been resewn and repaired in leather. Gold lines have been tooled on the spine just as in the original, and the book once again functions as a proper binding. So these were just two examples of bound diaries from the Veterans History Projects that have been treated by book conservators. Now, my colleague Gwen Ann is going to talk about several items that have been treated by paper conservators at the Library of Congress.
Hello, I'm Gwen Ann Edwards. I'm a paper conservator here at the library. And like Jennifer, I'm going to be focusing mainly on conservation treatments. So on the screen is a small sampling of materials from Veteran History Project collections that Library of Congress paper conservators have treated in recent years. So they include inscribed maps, watercolor drawings, and letters with ephemera. The first paper conservation treatment project that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail is a map drawn by Gail Madison, first lieutenant in the Army during the Vietnam War. The map depicts hamlets within Binh Thuan province, where Madison was stationed, and it contains a detailed legend identifying areas such as schools, locations of barbed wire, and communist-friendly enclaves. The map is drawn on transparent paper, which is similar to a modern tracing paper. So the materials in VHP's collections pose diverse problems to conservators. They're mostly on poor quality papers common of the 20th century, made with what limited access to materials would allow, and often intended to be used and exist only temporarily during the time of conflict. The paper on which the Madison map was drawn had become brittle, breaking where the object was most often handled, around the edges. This caused numerous losses and tears. There's also adhesive residue around the edges, which can be seen at the top in that center detail. And in this detail from the bottom edge, previous removal of a tape had pulled away the top layer of the paper, taking the blue-colored pencil along with it. So after examination and before conservation treatment, conservators test the paper and media, so that's any ink, paint, or other material applied to the surface, to ensure their methods of repair will not cause damage to the object. The extremely sensitive transparent paper and the modern colored media used in the Madison map required more extensive testing than normal. And this treatment also provided an excellent opportunity for a conservation intern under the supervision of a conservator to gain experience with the map's challenging materials. So prior to treatment, the intern tested several possible repair papers, adhesives, and mending techniques. And then based on her testing, she chose appropriate repairs that would prevent the media from bleeding, wouldn't distort the paper, and were invisible from the front of the object. And on the right, you can see an example of one of the tears that's been repaired. An adhesive from a previous tape on the top edge has also been reduced. And tape and adhesive is the most common condition issue conservators find when working on VHP's collections. And they can be removed with a variety of techniques, including heat, and that's what was done with the Madison map, and example of that kind of treatment is in the top left. Or with substances applied to the surface that soften the adhesive, and that technique's shown on the right. Although time-consuming, when going well, tape and adhesive removal is, I think, one of the most satisfying conservation treatments. So finally, the Madison map required filling in both paper and crayon losses. The intern filled the paper losses, such as the one shown in the bottom left of the slide, with a repair paper she created to match the original. So both that insert, as well as the one shown in the right, were then further toned to visually integrate the losses. And some of the materials conservators use for toning fills are shown in the top left. The toning materials are all either reversible or applied in a reversible way, as reversibility is a main tenet of ethical conservation practice. So reversibility is important because if we decide to remove any fills in the future, we can do so without causing damage to the object. So again, here was the map before conservation treatment, and then after it had been physically stabilized and the damage made less visually distracting. And it can now be safely handled by researchers without causing further damage. So most items from the Veterans History Project require less extensive conservation treatment. The goal of the next two treatments was to physically stabilize these two diaries of George Washington Piercy to prepare them for digitization. So the diaries were written on found papers while Piercy was imprisoned in Japanese camps in the Philippines, as Rachel described earlier. And I'll talk first about the diary on the left. So this diary was written on the backs of forms from Davao Prison, including forms recording the daily weather at the prison and prison hospital records. And you can see an example of a hospital form on the left indicating a case of appendicitis at the camp. And Piercy, like most prisoners of war at Japanese camps, suffered from numerous health ailments while imprisoned. And included in this diary is a list of his own health problems, and you can see that on the left, as well as a 12-page list of property he lost as a result of enemy bombing in the Philippines, which Rachel mentioned, and one page of this 12 pages is on the right. The list includes each item's cost, the date it was bought, and the condition when lost. So these diary pages were generally in fair condition with minor tears and breaks along the edges. So conservation treatment of the pages was limited to stabilization, reinforcing weak areas and mending tears. However, tucked into this diary were 5 documents that had been folded too tightly to safely open without further conservation treatment. These letters needed to be humidified to open. Humidification is a technique conservators use to reduce creases and folds, as well as to safely unroll tightly rolled supports. So using a humidification chamber, an example of a chamber is on the screen, moisture is introduced in a controlled manner to relax the paper fibers, and then the paper is flattened under weight. So humidification and flattening revealed 5 letters, one from Piercy's sister and the rest from his mother, sent to Piercy while imprisoned. The letters span the first half of 1943, and over the months show growing anxiety as his family had hardly heard from him since the beginning of the war. On the backs of the letters, Piercy drew detailed images, such as this map of Davao Prison, as well as drawings of other POW camps and the Japanese ship which transported the POWs. And although the drawings are incredibly precise, they're pretty difficult to interpret given the translucency of the paper and that the typewriting ink on the front interferes with their readability. So with more than a little digital manipulation following after-treatment photography, the drawings are now clearly legible. And this drawing in particular shows a detailed layout of Davao, including the main compound, the hospital, cemetery, and then the surrounding landscape, including the jungle and several farming plots. So these images, digitally enhanced by a conservator, will become part of the diary's permanent record. So finally, after humidification and flattening of the inserted letters and drawings, and mending of the diary pages, the metal clasp holding the pages together was removed prior to digitization as it concealed areas of the pages. While the clasp was separated from the diary, it was coated with a resin to prevent further corrosion of the metal and to prevent the paper from damaging interactions. And after digitization, the metal clasp was reattached, preserving the diary as it had been made. A custom enclosure was then made to safely store both the diary and the letters inside. So following the progression from the top left of the slide, the diary was placed in a 4-flap box, and then the box closed is in the top right, which was then placed in a larger 4-flap that could accommodate both the diary and the letters, which were larger than the diary after treatment. So the housing adequately protects both the diary and the drawings while maintaining their proximity. So another diary was written on the backs of food can labels, as Rachel showed, and remnants of US military papers. The contents of this diary are harrowing. As seen on the left, it includes detailed accounts of prison life and the sometimes brutal treatment the Filipinos and Americans endured, and memories of some of the military campaigns in which Piercy participated before being taken prisoner. And as Rachel mentioned, the diary also looks to the future. It includes a 4-page list, and the first page of this list is on the right, of things Piercy wanted to do after returning home, all of which he never got the chance to pursue. So conservation treatment of this diary was minimal. Folds along the edges were relaxed and flattened. Weak creases in danger of breaking were reinforced. Tears were mended, and losses bridged with repair paper. Like the other diary, the goal of this treatment was not aesthetic. Instead, stabilizing the object for handling and digitization was the focus, and preserving the evidence of its creation and use was paramount. And as a conservator, you're not really expecting to encounter materials like food can labels, but again, working with VHP's collections gives us an opportunity to work on some really unique materials. Finally, I want to briefly highlight another aspect of conservation other than treatment and housing. As Jennifer and I have noted, examination and photo documentation play important roles in conservation. Albert John Carpenter's World War I diary was brought to the Conservation Lab for stabilization prior to being displayed in the first rotation of the library's exhibition, Echoes of the Great War. As Rachel mentioned, the diary was saved from Hurricane Katrina, but at another point in its history had suffered from water damage, which had caused some of the inks to bleed. And the first page of the diary, shown on the left, is still legible despite the water damage, as only the ruled lines on the page have bled. However, there were numerous other pages that were illegible or only partially legible, where the water had caused more ink loss. As part of the conservation process, the paper conservator who treated the diary first did a thorough examination of the object. And one tool conservators commonly use for examination is ultraviolet radiation. And here you can see a conservator examining objects with ultraviolet light, which causes some materials to become apparent that can't normally be seen in visible light. So when the conservator used this examination technique on Carpenter's diary, the text made illegible by water damage and visible light on the left became legible when examined under ultraviolet light on the right. So she then captured this so that the images, with their now readable text, can provide more information to researchers. And Jennifer and I have detailed just a few aspects of conservation that help preserve our veterans' history today. I hope that you can see by the examples that we've shown the knowledge and investment that the library's conservation division lends to preserving VHP's collections. And when we preserve our veterans' history, we are increasing our understanding of our entire collective shared history. So thank you, and thank you especially to our VHP colleagues.
Thank you, everyone. We have a few minutes now to take questions, and then I believe after the conservators will be here and can talk you through a display of some of the materials from the Veterans History Project that we have here and have done some treatment work on.
So who decides the priority? Is it based on the risk or the condition or the value?
I'm going to call in a ringer. So a number of factors, but this is all done in consultation with a curator.
Yeah, there is not a simple answer to that. We have a long list of items that need treatment that is much longer than Preservation Directorate can handle in any given year. So we kind of find out what they have time for and then look at our priorities in terms of a variety of factors. Sometimes the things that come in recently are fresh in our minds, and so we have to go back and look at the full list and try to get some of the older items that we haven't looked at in a little while. But yeah, we try to work on the older items, but also prioritize things that would be more easily treated if we get to them immediately. Things like recently adhered tape that will come off much more easily if we do it now rather than putting it on the shelf for a few years. But yeah, there are a variety of factors that go into prioritizing.
Thank you. One of the things that we're conscious of in the Preservation Directorate is needing to strike a balance of what's critical, either because of a condition issue, something that needs to be taken care of immediately, what's crucial because of the library's current exhibition, digitization, and public service priorities, so World War I materials to accompany that exhibition, get some focus, but then also having sort of broad-based collections care strategies to slow down for the aggregate collections as much as possible the rate of damage or decay. So you saw a lot of boxes today in the conservators' presentations. That ensures that just during day-to-day handling and storage of the items, we're minimizing risk. We work very closely with the architect of the Capitol to make sure that we're optimizing the storage environments for collections. So recognizing that at any given day or year we can't work with every piece, we try to have strategies that embrace the whole collection. Yes?
Are the photographs we've been looking at this afternoon part of the conservation process, or is it part of a larger program to digitize the contents of the existing project? And by the way, what's the difference, if there is one, between preservation and conservation?
Sure, both good questions. So one question is about the photographs you've seen in some of these presentations and whether they're done simply for conservation purposes or to document and make the collections more accessible, and then also where we draw the line or how we balance between preservation and conservation. I'll speak to the less philosophical one first, and that is that conservation as a matter of good practice and professional ethics involves prior documentation of the condition of materials so that we understand the state in which they came to the collections, discussion with the curatorial staff so that we make sure to retain any important artifactual or physical evidence. The discussion, for example, of why you keep the tape on one thing and not another, well, that tape may tell you something about the material history of that object, and we work that out closely with the curatorial staff to make sure that we agree on a treatment plan. Some documentation is often done during treatment if we need to do further analysis or assessment as a treatment progresses. Occasionally, I think I'm looking at my conservators, there's a surprise and further research is conducted. And then, of course, we document the after state. That corpus of materials is important to us as we use that item in the future or as we have questions about it during research. It can also supplement the record of that item and become part of a plan to make it more accessible. There is an overlap between the digitization we have to do for the technical purposes of conservation and broader library goals to make sure that the collection remains digitally available. At 167 million items, we're very careful not to say anything about comprehensively digitizing the collections, but the library is engaged in a number of activities to, within certain bands of the collection, provide as much access as possible, and with certain types of materials to provide digital access. In some cases, that depends on user preference, exhibition priorities, particular interpretive areas that the library is working in. And our records may engage with or supplement that, especially where, as you've seen in some of those images, we're able, through our optical techniques, to bring to the fore aspects of the object that may not be clearly visible to the human eye. As for preservation and conservation, We sometimes make the kind of medical metaphor that we have a public health responsibility as well as a medical or surgical responsibility. And we think about preservation as sort of the stewardship goal of the library, that we want to provide good overarching care to the collections. That can involve corrective treatments or stabilization treatments that conservators execute. It can involve reformatting items. So one preservation strategy is to take something from obsolescent media and move it to a new format. We've done this with Veterans History Project, I think increasing amount as we get 21st century materials. The letters and diaries and photos of soldiers now are created on iPhones. They're sent as text communications, and that material needs to be migrated off of its original digital carriers into new platforms. We also do a great deal in the preservation realm for environmental control, emergency response. We have a 24/7 team that's available to respond in case there's any emergency that affects the collections in the library. So we think about preservation as an all-encompassing strategy and conservation as an important element of the interventions that we take with those items over time. Great. Thank you. I think I'll hand it over to our conservators, or Karen, if you'd like to say it last.
In conclusion, I just really want to thank the Preservation Directorate and Jake for all that they do to help us make sure that these important veterans' narratives remain accessible into the future. And also, I want to thank you all for coming today. Take care.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.